All right, so we've got this pretty bold prediction to unpack today. It says here, India to account for 16% of global consumption by 2050.
Wow.
That's straight from McKinsey. And, that right away signals a huge potential shift in, global economics.
Definitely.
So for today's deep dive, we're going to dig into this Ionic chart book on the consumption boom in India.
Okay.
I'm really curious to kind of break this down with you and, really get a sense of what's driving this projected explosion in Indian consumption. We're going to look beneath the big headline numbers here and figure out why this should matter to anyone listening. Why should you care about this?
Right.
This chart book is packed with projections and growth rates and some really fascinating analysis of how Indian consumers are behaving today and how they're expected to behave in the future.
Interesting.
But what's really important to note is that this isn't just some future fantasy. Consumption is already a major force in India's economy right now.
It's amazing when you think about it, just how much consumption is already the engine of the Indian economy. I mean, it currently accounts for a very substantial 56% of the country's GDP.
Wow.
And it's not just a big part of the picture, it's the part that's growing the fastest.
That's huge.
Yeah, if you look at China, for example, consumption contributes about 39% to their GDP. Based on the latest data we have, and that really highlights how much more India's economy is already geared towards, what people are actually buying.
It's not just a promise for the future, it's happening now.
Exactly.
And when you look at those future projections, it's really quite mind-blowing. We're talking about a potential doubling of India's total consumption by the year 2034.
Double.
That's incredible.
That's a lot.
And get this, the pace of that growth is twice as fast as what we expect to see in the U.S. That puts India on a very clear trajectory to having the fastest growing consumer base in the entire world.
That raises some pretty big questions.
It does?
About, how this is all going to play out. The chart book gives us some pretty specific numbers that really highlight this.
Okay.
The compound annual growth rate, the key AGR for private consumption in India, is projected to be 9.0% for the period from fiscal year 2024 to 2030.
9%.
9% now. Compare that to the anticipated growth in China at 7.2%, and in the USA at just 4.4%.
Yeah.
And you can see there's a serious acceleration happening in India.
Yeah.
Another thing that's really telling is that this projected private consumption growth at 7.6% is expected to outpace other key areas of the Indian economy.
Like what?
Things like exports are projected to grow at 7.1%.
Okay.
Capital expenditure at 6.1%, and even government consumption at 3.8%.
Wow, so consumer spending is really leading the charge.
It really is. And what's interesting? Imports are actually projected to decrease slightly by 1.1%, while spending on, more premium goods is only expected to grow by 1%. Yeah. The overall GDP growth is forecast at a healthy 6.5%.
Yeah.
But it's really the consumer that's driving this whole thing.
So for anyone listening, that 9% growth isn't just some abstract number.
Exactly.
It means a consumer market that's expanding at an incredible rate, and that creates both huge opportunities and also, potential shifts in the global economic landscape.
It does.
So let's dig into what's actually fueling this huge appetite for consumption in India.
Okay.
The chart book points to a few key drivers, and one that I found really interesting is the changing structure of households.
Okay.
Can you walk us through what's happening there?
Sure. So what we're seeing is that the number of households in India is actually growing at a faster pace than the overall population.
That's interesting.
It is. And this trend towards more nuclear families.
Yeah.
Smaller, more individual household units is a really important factor driving increased consumption.
I see.
Think about it. When you have more separate households,
Right.
even if the total number of people stays the same, you naturally have more demand for a wider range of things.
All right, more homes need more stuff.
Exactly. More appliances, more furniture, more pretty much everything.
Makes sense.
It's a fundamental driver of increased spending across the board.
Right, more individual living units just naturally translate to more individual consumption needs. And then there's just the sheer size and potential of India's workforce. I was struck by that statistic about India being on track to lead the world in workforce growth.
That's a big deal.
That's a massive demographic advantage.
It is. And that projection that 1 in 5 working age people globally will be Indian. That's a really significant demographic shift with some major economic consequences.
Definitely.
Your chart book put some hard numbers on this.
Okay.
Between 2023 and 2050. India's working population is expected to increase by a staggering 859 million people.
That's incredible.
To put that in perspective, The U.S. is only projected to see an increase of 156 million during that same period.
And what about other parts of the world?
Well, major economic regions like Japan, the Euro area, and even China are actually looking at contractions in their working populations.
Really?
Japan by 9 million, the Euro area by 19 million, and China by 38 million.
Wow.
So you have this massive influx of people in India entering their prime earning years, and that directly translates into a much greater capacity for consumption.
Right, a larger workforce with more disposable income.
Exactly.
It's a pretty clear path to increased spending.
It is, but it's not just about how much people are earning. It's also about what they're doing with those earnings.
Right.
And the chart book highlights a pretty significant surge in savings that's projected.
So tell me about that, because that seems really crucial to understanding how sustainable this consumption boom could actually be.
It is India's total savings over the next 25 years are projected to be 10 times the total savings accumulated over the past 25 years.
10 times.
10 times. That's a huge amount of potential capital that can be channeled in to spending and investment. To give you some context, aggregate gross domestic savings in India grew from $3 trillion in fiscal year 1997 to $10 trillion in fiscal year 2023. And the projection for fiscal year 2047 is a staggering $30 trillion.
Wow, that's a lot of future spending power just waiting to be unleashed.
It really is.
And it seems like the government is actively trying to encourage people to spend more through these recent tax cuts.
That's right. The recent tax cuts, which amount to about 1 lakh crore rupees, are designed to put more money directly into the hands of consumers and encourage them to spend.
And is that expected to have a significant impact?
The analysis in the chart book suggests a pretty substantial multiplier effect. For every rupee in tax savings, it's estimated that 3.3 rupees will be added to overall consumption in the economy.
Really?
And this could potentially boost GDP by around 1%.
That's significant.
This multiplier effect of 3.3x is based on an estimated marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, of 0.7, which essentially means that for every extra rupee of disposable income people have, they're likely to spend 70 paise of it.
Okay, so we've got this growing number of households, a rapidly expanding workforce, a huge increase in savings, and government policies that are all pushing towards more consumption. What I find particularly fascinating is how that spending is actually changing what are people buying. The chart book talks about some emerging consumption themes, and especially a shift towards what they call discretionary spending.
This is where we start to see some really interesting shifts in consumer behavior and priorities.
Okay.
The chart book draws a parallel with what happened in countries like the U.S. and China. As their economies grew and incomes rose, spending on what we call discretionary items, those things that people want rather than strictly need, started to outpace spending on essential or non-discretionary goods. The expectation is that India will follow a similar pattern as its per capita income continues to rise above the $2,000 mark.
So basically, as people become more financially secure,
Exactly.
they start to treat themselves more.
And this is similar to what China went through. During its boom years between 2007 and 2011, when their per capita income roughly doubled.
So this shift towards discretionary spending isn't just about people buying more stuff in general.
It's about people's priorities changing.
It's a sign of increasing economic well-being.
Precisely.
So which specific categories are seeing the biggest jumps in this discretionary spending?
The chart book highlights a few key areas.
Okay.
Consumer electronics, apparel, and accessories,
Yeah.
including jewelry, and the entire experience economy, which includes things like travel and entertainment.
I see.
If we compare the projected growth rates between fiscal years 2024 and 2027 to the growth we saw between 2018 and 2024, we see a clear acceleration in a lot of these areas.
Like what specifically?
Well, consumer electronics, for example, are expected to grow from 11.7% to 14.1%.
Okay.
The jewelry sector from 10.4% to 14.0%,
Yep.
non-apparel accessories from 10% to 14.9%, and apparel is projected to see the biggest jump from 11.4% to 16.0%.
Wow.
The experience economy is also forecast to see strong growth at 11.0% between fiscal years 2024 and 2030.
The experience economy, that makes a lot of sense. As incomes rise and people have more money to spend,
Right.
they start looking for more than just material goods. And speaking of entertainment, it seems like the way people in India are consuming entertainment is changing dramatically, too.
It is. The chart book points to a really significant shift in entertainment consumption patterns in India, with things like online gaming live events and over-the-top or OTT streaming services becoming the main drivers of growth between 2023 and 2026. This is all part of a much larger $762 billion expansion in the media and entertainment sector, with the digital segments really leading the way at a projected $301 billion.
So digital is really taking over.
Within that digital space, online gaming is expected to reach $167 billion. Live events, $55 billion, and OTT services, $28 billion.
So those are the big winners.
They are traditional forms of entertainment, like television and print media, are seeing much slower growth in comparison.
So it's not just that people are spending more, it's that they're choosing to spend their money on different things.
It is, and it raises the question of who's actually doing most of this discretionary spending.
Yeah, who's driving this shift?
The chart book points to what they call a Pareto pattern.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it highlights a really significant concentration of spending in India.
Okay.
The top 10% of consumers currently account for a whopping 67% of all discretionary spending in the country.
Wow. So a small group of people are having a big impact.
This is a classic example of the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, where a small segment of the population is responsible for a large share of a particular activity.
I see.
In this case, it's those non-essential purchases.
Right. The things people want but don't necessarily need.
Exactly.
That's a really important insight for anyone who's, looking at the Indian consumer market.
It is.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about where all this purchasing is actually happening.
Okay.
Because it seems like India's retail landscape is still dominated by traditional stores.
That's a very accurate observation. Despite the growth of modern retail and e-commerce, the vast majority, a striking 92% of all retail trade in India, still flows through what we call the unorganized sector.
So explain what that means.
Sure, that primarily refers to the ubiquitous kirana stores. Those small, often family-run neighborhood shops.
I know exactly what you mean.
They're a real cornerstone of Indian communities.
They are.
If you compare this to more mature retail markets like the U.S., the U.K., China, and Japan, where modern trade and online retail are dominant, you see a huge difference.
How so?
Well, in the U.S., for instance, only about 12% of retail sales happen through traditional channels.
Yeah.
Compared to 92% in India.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, and it highlights just how much potential there is for modern retail. Things like supermarkets and large format stores to grow in India.
Right. They have a lot of room to expand.
They do. The chart book points out that an incredible 95% of the postal code areas, or PIN codes in India, are currently unserved by organized retail.
95%.
95%. So for anyone in the retail space, this represents a huge opportunity.
That really puts it into perspective.
It does.
Finally, we can't talk about the future of consumption in India without discussing its young population, especially Gen Z. The numbers surrounding them are incredible.
They really are. India has more Gen Z individuals than the entire population of the United States. And their economic influence is only going to grow in the coming years.
And how much are they projected to spend?
By 2035, it's projected that every other rupee spent in India will come from a Gen Z consumer.
Every other rupee, that's amazing.
Their total spending power is expected to reach a staggering $2 trillion.
That's a huge shift in economic power.
It is.
So where are Gen Z in India choosing to spend their money?
The chart book breaks down their spending habits in detail.
Okay.
Fashion and lifestyle currently make up the biggest chunk of their spending at 47%. Which represents about $45 billion.
Okay.
Travel and vacation are also a high priority for them at 44%. And that's about $75 billion in spending.
Wow.
Beauty and personal care come in at 47%, or $30 billion. While packaged food and beverages represent 45% of their spending, which is about $20 billion.
And what about technology?
Consumer tech devices also take up a big portion of their spending at 45%, or about $30 billion.
So they like their gadgets.
They do. What's interesting is that eating out and ordering in represent a substantial 48% of their spending. But that only translates to about $7 billion in total spend.
Oh.
And online gaming, while making up a large 47% of their spending categories, currently only accounts for a very small $0.3 billion.
So there's a lot of potential for growth there.
There is for businesses trying to reach this generation. Understanding these specific spending preferences is really important.
So to bring it all together for everyone listening, This deep dive into the Ionic part book really paints a vivid picture of this massive consumption boom that's happening in India.
Yeah.
It's being driven by a powerful combination of factors we talked about, those demographic shifts with more and smaller households and this huge and growing young workforce, rising incomes and savings, evolving consumer preferences that are leaning towards discretionary spending and new forms of entertainment, and this vast, largely untapped potential in the retail sector. All of this is amplified by the growing economic influence of Gen Z.
It's a truly transformative time for India.
It is.
And, it's not just about gradual growth.
Yeah,
The sheer scale of this transformation is incredible.
it is.
That quote we started with from McKinsey about India becoming the consumption capital of the world by 2050.
Yeah.
When you look at all these underlying trends,
Mhm.
it doesn't seem like such a far-fetched idea.
It's definitely within the realm of possibility.
It is.
So here's something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about all these trends today. The huge scale of India's projected consumption boom, the shift towards discretionary spending, the rise of Gen Z consumers, the changes in the retail landscape. What are some of the ripple effects you think this might create, not just within India, but globally in the coming decades? Think beyond just the economic growth numbers. How
Right.
might this impact society, culture, even the environment? That's something worth pondering. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It is my pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating look at the forces shaping our world.